Hey everyone, and welcome to the Sunny Go One Piece podcast. On this episode, we're going to be covering episodes 792 through 794, which will cover manga chapters 831 through 834. And the Straw Hats get lost in the Seducing Woods, and this is where we begin to see why Sanji hates his family, and especially his father, Vinsmoke Judge, so much. Alright, so synopsis. As Nami, Chopper, and Carrot chase after who they think is Sanji, they get lured further and further into the Seducing Woods, and now separated from Luffy, it becomes incredibly dire. Meanwhile, Sanji comes face to face with his biological father for the first time since he ran away, and we get a glimpse into his power as well as Sanji's abusive past with his family. Alright, so let's get into the differences. So, in episode 792, after the commercial break, after Randall throws his spear at the trio, there's a quick added filler scene in the anime between Sanji and Yonji in the halls of the Germa castle, where Yonji antagonizes Sanji a bit about the marriage, and then they get into a bit of a scuffle that we don't really get to see the conclusion of. Now, this scene isn't completely filler, as in later chapters this moment is referenced, and in the manga it just happens off screen, but won't become relevant till the events of chapter 833 or the very next episode in 793. And where we see Yonji getting his face repaired after presumably losing to Sanji and getting his face caved in. In the manga, this is never shown, and the fight with Randolph is never interrupted, and it goes straight into Randolph's spear jabbing into the back of that weird buried giant's head. Now, speaking of episode 793, in that episode, the anime shows the actual events depicted in the giant portrait of Judge, whereas in the anime, this is never actually seen. So there's that scene where he takes over the four nations in the West Blue, and we see this giant portrait of Judge standing over the bodies of the three leaders of those nations. And in the anime, we actually get to kind of see that moment where he beats them all. But the manga, it just shows you the portrait. None of that actually takes place. There's also an added scene between Judge challenging Sanji and Yonji getting repaired, of Luffy running around lost in the Seducing Woods. Now, in the manga, the chapter ends with Judge challenging Sanji, and then the next chapter begins with Yonji being worked on. You actually see this quite often in the next couple episodes, where it'll cut back to what's happening in the Seducing Woods when the manga never really showed it. There's another example of this later on as well. But after Sanji loses to Judge, there's an extra added scene in the anime of Luffy contending with the Seducing Forest and getting further lost, and even added an extra scene of him running back into the strange giant stuck in the ground, and even helping him out by taking out the spear in his head thrown by Randolph. This was never in the manga, but it's obviously implied. Directly following this scene, there's an added moment where Brook and Pedro in the Shark Submerged 3 approaching Sweet City. Now, this technically does happen in the manga, but it doesn't actually take place until the next chapter/episode, and this moment just kind of expands on them arriving in Sweet City. In the manga, after Sanji loses, it goes straight to Reiju treating Sanji's wounds. And so, yeah, a lot of this is just kind of filling in the blanks, which, again, filler-wise, it's not the worst thing in the world, because yeah, all of it is relevant, and it sets up actual things that happen in canon. So they're not like completely useless filler. It just adds a little bit more context to what happens, and when we, in the manga, when we actually do see what is actually being the result of that. Towards the end of episode 794, we get even more scenes of Luffy in the Seducing Forest being messed with by Brule and her mirror copy technique, as he's given the runaround by all the copies of Chopper, Nami, and Carrot. Now, in the manga, this scene isn't shown, but it's implied that this happened off screen, but we only get to see the aftermath of this, but not in this set of the episodes. We'll see what happens in the next podcast, which I'll describe in that episode. So yeah, this definitely sets up a moment that we do see in the manga later on. But yeah, that's it for the differences, so let's get into the episodes themselves. So continuing on right from where we last left off, we're immediately treated to an insanely weird sight as the trio of Carrot, Chopper, and Nami continue to chase after Sanji, and they abruptly come upon a giant man whose body has been buried in the ground with only his massive head and arms still above ground. Chopper begins by showing some genuine concern and wanting to help this man, but this guy's response is that he buried himself willingly and put himself in this position, which pisses Chopper off even more than I've ever seen him outside of, some more serious situations. And it's pretty amusing seeing Chopper get this worked up over this guy's random ramblings, especially when he starts talking about juice and wanting juice. This man's obsession with juice is also a pretty funny running joke. Although, as if that sight wasn't weird enough, you then get a rabbit riding a giant crane slicing through talking trees that are screaming in pain after having been chopped in half. Like, what is happening? This white rabbit is probably another reference to Alice in Wonderland's White Rabbit. As you can tell based on its little smirk, it's pushing them further into the Seducing Woods, further into the rabbit hole, as it were, like the white rabbit did with Alice in that story. And curiously, though, in the manga, the rabbit actually never smirks. So this is something that they added in the anime. Although it probably seems like it's implied in the manga, but not really. But later on, Carrot confirms to us that whatever this rabbit is, it's not a mink, which means it could have been a new Zone Devil Fruit user. Additionally, we learned that this rabbit's name is Randolph, which is a really random name, but it's also really cool. And I have to admit, Randolph has a really cool character design as well. So yeah, he not only is this character just really cool, but he just looks cool. But at this point, they all come to the conclusion that something is seriously wrong with this forest, as nothing about anything makes any sense, and it seems like it's messing with them. And they decide they need to regroup with Luffy, but it's too late as the Seducing Woods comes to life with another short musical number. But unlike what we're used to when colorful things come to life and start singing at you, we get yet another twisted perversion of that trope that's incredibly creepy and unsettling, where they start singing about the Seducing Woods murdering them. Like, yikes. This is where the anime medium really shines, though, because in the manga, you of course can't have music, and you can only read the lyrics, but hearing them sing adds another layer to the creepiness and unsettling nature of that. And I like that they went the extra mile to actually compose music for these songs. And the Seducing Woods can be, from what I can tell, is a reference to the Tolgi Woods in Alice in Wonderland, which particularly from my research is found in Through the Looking Glass, because I've never actually read the books. I've only seen the movies. But it does appear in the Disney version of the animated Alice in Wonderland movie as well. Randolph continues to pursue them as they try and escape, and eventually find their way back to the giant stuck in the ground, as he accidentally takes Randolph's spear to the head, and eventually find their way back to Luffy. But as they're running away, the wrong Luffy joins them. As the real Luffy tries to warn them, it's not him, but he gets caught and stopped from yelling. So now they have a fake mirror Luffy following them. But to make matters worse, they're now lost going in circles as they somehow keep winding back at that buried giant, despite the fact they keep going back the same route. And it immediately becomes clear what's going wrong with this picture, as they notice everything in the forest is sentient and now moving. Even the ground itself is like moving with like a face and eyes and everything. The forest has been rearranging itself, confusing them. To make matters worse, though, the fake Luffy turns into the actual culprit who's messing with them. The mirror Luffy transforms into this very tall, haggard-looking woman and reveals herself to be Charlotte Brûlé, the 8th daughter of Big Mom. Carrot's first reaction is asking if she is a tree, which is pretty funny. And they've run into several talking trees at this point, but I still find it hilarious that her immediate reaction is to ask if she's a tree. This would also start a joke bit of people mistakenly referring to her as a tree because of her incredibly tall, slender, and kind of dark skin color. And this one really won't manifest till later, because it becomes an incredible running joke throughout the entire arc. And so Brûlé has many different references and inspirations associated with her. Obviously, just like everything else so far in this arc has been related to sort of fairy tales and all of that. So first off, Her name, of course, is another sweet dessert or food item like all of Big Mom's other children. This time it's creme brulee, which is a rich custard-based dessert topped with a layer of hardened caramelized sugar, with the blowtorch and everything. I love creme brulee. It's amazing. Brulee also has a lot of allusions to many fairy tale characters and tropes. However, I'm going to hold off talking about these references until we get to see her full character and what her actual ability is and how it's explained. Because I think in order to actually talk about these references properly, we kind of need the big picture of Brulee. So I don't want to spoil who she is and what her abilities are just yet. So we'll definitely talk about those when she actually gets those revealed. But anyways, moving on, from the Seducing Woods, we move to the Germa Kingdom, which, as we learned, is a nation without borders and is comprised of about a dozen independent ships that then come together to form a nation that is ruled by the Vinsmoke family. The Germa Kingdom, with their ideology of militarism and scientific advancement, along with the fact that Germa is only 2 letters shy of German, it is believed that Germa is inspired in part by Nazi Germany, particularly as we will see later their willingness to advance technology and science with very questionable and inhumane methods. This is something you don't see in the anime, but in the manga, the Germa Kingdom flag bears the Nordic cross, reflecting its sort of European nature, and as well as the European architecture with its medieval castles. But this could also be yet another reference to Nazi Germany, as the Nordic cross was used for the Nazi German war ensign, which is why I think Toei opted to remove the vertical line from the cross in the flag. And when you watch the anime, the flag only contains the horizontal line with the double sixes. Whereas if you look at it in the manga, you do see the full Nordic cross, both the vertical and the horizontal line with the double sixes plastered right there where the swastika would have been if you look at like one of the old German war ensign flags, or that Nazi German war ensign flags. But once we get inside to where Sanji and Reiju are, we get to see our first glimpse of Sanji's father in sort of a really grotesque, huge self-portrait right out of the fascist dictator's playbook. And Reiju then basically serves as an exposition vessel to tell us about Germa and the Vinsmoke's philosophy of being conquerors with all that power and wealth, that they deserve and are entitled to do whatever they want. Even offering Sanji a whole group of beautiful women for him to do whatever. But despite at first going all heart-eyed and kind of like simping for them, he doesn't actually pay any more attention to these women, which honestly is growth on Sanji, or an indication of just how much he hates his family, because he probably knows how crappy they treat these women. And so I think at first he's overwhelmed by their beauty, but immediately he comes to his senses and says, yeah, I don't want anything to do with these women because they've probably been treated pretty badly. And this is where Sanji's father, Vinsmoke Judge, makes his first appearance. And this man is pretty damn huge and not really at all what I envisioned him to look like. I guess when I pictured Sanji, like his father, I pictured more of like the slimy car salesman kind of guy who was like very slim, very similar to Sanji and his brothers, but instead he's like this hulking guy with like a lot of flourishes to the point where he's even wearing a helmet with a mask. But interestingly, out of all of Judge's kids, Sanji is the only one to have his blonde hair. The one son that seemed to reject him the most is the one that's most physically similar to him. It's a bit of poetic irony there, and we'll get more into this fact as we learn more about Judge and his relationship to Sanji. You can already tell just how much Sanji detests Judge and how much contempt Judge has for Sanji. And Sanji mentions that if he were to call someone father, he certainly wouldn't be calling them, but he would be calling somebody else father. And of course, he's referring to Zeph, who in Sanji's mind is his real father, as we all know. Something I've always wondered why Oda named this character Judge. It seems like such an odd name for this character, and it doesn't really follow the number plus G pattern. You have like Ichi, Ji, Ni, Ji, San, Ji, Yon, Ji. Like, you have that pattern, But you could look at it from the perspective that in Japanese, his name actually begins and ends with G. As in Japanese, you would pronounce judge as Jiyaji, or Jaji. So he doesn't really need a number since he's the originator, I guess. And so, yeah, he's just a lot of G. So maybe that's why it is. I don't really know. Yeah, I don't know that Oda has ever actually said this, and I did look into this, but yeah, I couldn't really find any particular reason for this. And the other interesting thing is that in the One Piece magazine volume 3, there were some of Oda's notes published, and one of them depicted one of Judge's original designs, and he also had him named Saint Germain to probably more closely emphasize sort of the Germa and the Nazi Germany connection. And now, just to be clear, the saint in his name isn't the same saint as the Celestial Dragons. As in Oda's notes, he has it written out as Saint Germain, whereas for the Celestial Dragons, their name is said and written as Se as the suffix to denote the saint in their name. So, for example, like Saint Charlos would be Charlose. And so, yeah, the Saint Germain is definitely different from the Celestial Dragons. What the difference in the terms actually mean, I honestly don't have a good answer for you. I tried looking into this, but yeah, I couldn't find a good answer what the difference between Sang and Se is. But I would imagine there maybe like San is more just like for like names, whereas Se is an actual title. So like, a saint is an actual title. So maybe that's the difference. But yeah, I honestly couldn't tell you. I wish I had a good answer for this, but I couldn't find one in my research. Maybe I need to ask one of my Japanese relatives who's more knowledgeable about the Japanese language to see if they can help me with that one. But yeah. Anyways, it's here we learn that in that confrontation with Yonji that we saw in the filler scene, Sanji came out on top. One note, in the Crunchyroll subs, specifically because the manga seems to get this right, but the subtitles are kind of wrong here, as it's translated as, "What did you do to Yonji? He must be quite strong." In Japanese, what he actually is saying is, "Did you do something to Yonji? He's quite strong." He's not questioning Yonji's strength. Like, I don't know why it sounds like he's questioning it in the subtitles. But in the Japanese wording, he's stating it as a fact. Like, Yonji is strong and you still beat him. And I thought this was such a weird mistranslation that I think this might just be a rare, like, mistake. That they just mistakenly translated this, because it doesn't seem right at all. But the scene ends with Judge essentially challenging Sanji to a duel to put him in his place, which is surprising because it's hard to see Judge being stronger than Sanji. But if he's confident he can beat Sanji after knowing Sanji can take down Yonji, means he still must be pretty confident and decently capable. And speaking of Yonji, in the scene following this, we can see Yonji being worked on by a doctor, or maybe a scientist, engineer, or mechanic. It's hard to say because it seems like Yonji and Sanji's brothers are all like, I don't know if they're androids or cyborgs. Like, I say this because we see Yonji's injuries are more, or I guess more apt word would be damage, he's being treated more like a machine than a living organism. And that, of course, gets you thinking maybe Sanji, like his brothers, are also enhanced like this, explaining his insane strength and durability despite, appearing like a normal human and not possessing devil fruit powers, which I know at the time I felt uneasy about the prospect of that, because I like the idea that Sanji was just a normal, I guess I should say relatively normal human that was just gifted, but also trained hard to be that strong. And I felt it would kind of take away from Sanji's overall character a bit, like he was treated almost like a chosen one, bestowed with extra powers. But seeing Yonji get fixed by getting hydraulic pressed made me also think, are these guys even human at this point, or were they actual androids more akin to like 17 and 18 from Dragon Ball Z, which I know they were both human initially, but by the time we see them in the series, they're mostly machines. However, we will get an answer to this in just a bit. Sanji and Judge begin their duel, and while Judge definitely seems like he can hold his own, it seems like it's pretty clear that Sanji can beat him if it was a fair fight, especially. But Judge is one of those ruthless fighters who would do and use anything to win a fight, kind of like Don Krieg, like using every weapon and trick possible to even sacrificing his own men. He has that classic villain mentality of might is right and win at all costs. And in the middle of the fight, we launch into sort of a mini flashback to when Sanji was a kid, still within the Germa Kingdom before his time with Zeph and the Baratie. And of course, since Ikue Otani voiced young Sanji back in the original flashback during the Baratie arc, she reprises her role as young Sanji again, which is nice probably because Ikue Otani is on staff as Chopper most of the time. But one thing you might notice is that I think Okumura Akemi voices young Yonji. It sounds like her. I didn't look this up, but yeah, it does sound like her. In this flashback, we do get to see that Sanji was created to be enhanced like his brothers, but for some reason his enhancements didn't manifest and he came out more or less human or normal. So he doesn't seem to have the super strength or durability, but also it's fairly apparent in their personalities. His three brothers seem unusually cold and cruel, especially towards Sanji, who is different from him, getting mercilessly picked on and beaten. In this one scene, you learn exactly why he despises his family and wanted to run away, because when Sanji pleads to his father for help, he asks why. And it would be a waste since he has no value as a soldier and therefore isn't worth his time to raise or even help. And that is just insanely cruel. Like, this entire scene is just brutal, and it's kind of hard to watch, seeing this young child Sanji absolutely helpless, being beaten senseless to a pulp by his brothers. And there's even a crazier and crueler aspect to this that was teased later on in this scene towards the end of this fight, and that's seeing Sanji in some kind of like iron mask and imprisoned. So this situation seems like it's going to get even further darker and worse for Sanji, which, you know, we're definitely going to see a flashback at some point for this. But one thing I do love about this further insight into Sanji is that we begin to really see why he is the way he is, and explains many of his actions throughout the series, which I will dive further into as we get more of this flashback and as it unfolds. But one thing that I found interesting with this flashback is that while Reiju isn't involved in the actual bullying and beatings like her brothers, she's still seen unbothered and even laughs at Sanji being beat up. And this kind of combined with her sort of taking care of Sanji after the fight and her willingness to help Luffy with the poison earlier kind of paints an interesting character where she's obviously not a great person, but does seem to still have a tiny bit more compassion than her younger brothers outside of Sanji. It's definitely something to keep watching as the arc progresses to see like what actually is the deal with Reiju, because she doesn't seem quite as messed up as her brothers or Judge, but obviously she's not quite as kind as Sanji is. So it almost like she falls somewhere in the middle, or I guess not in the middle, but she's somewhere in between, but probably closer to the sort of the uncaring side of things with her brothers. When we return from the mini flashback to the duel, Judge turns it on a bit as he begins to use the tech embedded in his suit, like the boots with the thrusters that allow him to jump and fly, but also enhance his kicking power. Additionally, it generates electricity as well. At this point, it's not entirely clear if Judge himself has had genetic enhancements to his body like his kids, or if this is all embedded into his suit and he himself isn't necessarily superpowered, but all of his equipment is. But needless to say, Judge is no slouch, as he does possess at least a baseline amount of strength and speed, as he can react and stop Sanji's Diablo Jambe Collier shoot just by grabbing it mid-kick and throwing him down, which is pretty impressive given how people with even like Rokushiki and using Tekkai mention just how heavy and hard those kicks are. Both Judge and Reiju are genuinely surprised though that someone like Sanji can use Haki, probably because they figured he, since he's such a loser, he didn't have the willpower to actually manifest Haki. So yeah, there's that. The other interesting thing to note about this scene, when Judge tells Sanji to take up a sword to continue the fight, as he's trained him in the past with sword combat, it might explain why he was so adept at using those knives versus Wanze on the Puffing Tom, the the ramen guy in the Water 7 arc. And it might also go to explain why he hates swordsmen so much, because he was forced to learn swordsmanship and he just hated it. After Sanji is knocked down, he has this bit of contemplation with his younger self where he asks whether being blood related is really that important, and if that alone inherently warrants respect from them. And this is one of the many questions and themes of this arc that it really explores when it comes to what does it mean to be a family, and what does blood relations actually mean, and how that compares to a found family, you know? And this is certainly a question that many people have tackled in real life. Maybe not to this extreme, but in some cases, yeah, it can be this extreme. Like, do you owe anything to your family members, especially if they're, you know, not the greatest of people? Many people have come from broken or even abusive families, and this absolutely is something that people struggle with, whether they owe anything to their abusive parents and what their obligation and responsibility is to their so-called family, just because they're related by blood. Now, from my own experience, you know, I just want to make it clear, I didn't come from a broken home or abusive family. My family is great, but most, you know, I think at the same time, I never really had the closest relationship with my family, especially my parents. But I always had the amazingly good fortune to find amazing family or amazing friends, and often felt far more comfortable and at peace when I was with my friends. And so balancing kind of that responsibility and duty to my blood family is always kind of something that I always think about. And again, I want to make it clear, my situation is more just normal life inconveniences. So I don't want to conflate my situation with people who are actually in really difficult or horrific situations, such as an abusive or dysfunctional family, who have real struggles. But I merely wanted to point out that I can kind of somewhat see where Sanji is coming from in that respect. It's like, how do you balance that? And what do you actually owe to your family? And especially, you know, looking at it from like a Japanese culture where, yeah, the sort of the extended family structure is still somewhat of a thing. I think in Japan, it does seem to be kind of decreasing a little bit with the younger generation. You know, your more traditional nuclear family. But, you know, there is still a great emphasis put on your elders and extended family and, you know, the responsibility to your family. And so, yeah, I can honestly see that is something that a lot of Japanese people definitely think about and struggle with. Sanji ends up losing the duel because, unlike his father, he isn't willing to sacrifice others like his father, as Judge uses his soldiers as a human shield and then stabs through one of them to attack Sanji. However, I feel like at no point does Sanji actually look hurt or was even struggling that hard. Sure, he takes a few hits, but I do think Sanji could have taken Judge out if he wanted to. But I always felt like for Sanji, again, this was just as much an emotional and psychological battle within himself that was hampering his ability to actually concentrate on the fight. And instead, he was kind of wrestling with his own mind more so than Judge physically. And this ends the duel with Reiju treating Sanji for his sort of minor injuries, but she states that Sanji's strength and durability is greater than she expected. And I think Judge also notes this as well when he states, "You definitely have my blood." So perhaps his genetic enhancements didn't necessarily fail. They were just very latent and didn't manifest till later in life. Who knows? But then again, Sanji still has like the kind personality. So it is interesting how all of this kind of works out, and especially because we don't really know what Judge actually did to his kids. We just know that they're genetic enhancements, but what exactly changed and how does that actually manifest itself? We don't quite know yet. Judge then shows his true intentions of why he wants Big Mom's power and why he needs to give up one of his kids to enter into this arrangement, but not wanting to give up his 4 prized children. He remembered that he has Sanji, which prompted this whole search for him. And to make sure that he doesn't run, he gets those celestial dragon collars that are put on slaves' necks, but in a smaller version placed on his hands in the form of these explosive bracelets, making it even more likely that they will have to eventually confront Big Mom, and getting away stealthily will be pretty much near impossible at this point. Like, it seems like the idea of getting in and getting out is not going to happen, and that they will probably have to face Big Mom in some way by this arc. And yeah, I remember thinking, yeah, we're definitely fighting Big Mom at this point. But yeah, Sanji is now trapped with no way to leave without at least without the risk of losing his hands. And it creates a dire situation, as even if Luffy and company can somehow make it out of the Seducing Woods to get to Sanji, they need to somehow steal the key to his explosive handcuffs, because right now we've only seen one time where someone has been able to remove these, and that was Rayleigh when he ripped off Kami's handcuffs, but we don't quite know how he did it, because it doesn't seem like that's something anyone can do. Otherwise, you feel like more people would just rip those off, because it doesn't seem to be a matter of power or strength, because obviously these guys can crush like boulders with their fists, so like a small piece of metal shouldn't be that big of a deal, but it seems like you need something a little more to get these off. But yeah, that's where we'll leave off these sets of episodes. So yeah, this next couple episodes are definitely, I think, one of the more controversial things about Whole Cake Island is the whole thing in the Seducing Woods, because a lot of people feel like it takes so long and it drags on for so long. And to some extent, yeah, it's not as bad as in the manga, but in the anime, whew, it is bad. Yeah, this is definitely one of those pacing issues. So, but yeah, we'll keep trudging along through the Seducing Woods. But if you did enjoy this, send me a like or comment. And if you want to join me on this journey of rewatching One Piece, please consider subscribing. It really helps me. And I also enjoy seeing the likes and comments and some new subscribers. So thank you very much. Also, check out my Instagram at SunnyGo Podcast for updates when I post new episodes, and see pictures of my manga collection, as I am finally starting to re-upload on my Instagram account. So yeah, definitely look forward to that. And of course, just listening to the podcast is always enough for me. But if you feel like supporting me extra, you can always check out my Buy Me a Coffee profile. And as always, I wanted to thank you for taking the time out to listen to my podcast. No spoiler section on this episode, so stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the next episode. Bye!